Is the Supreme Court partisan and illegitimate now? That's what we're being told by Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson and other progressive commentators. I'm Rich Lowry of National Review, and this is continued fallout from the court's historic racial gerrymandering case about a week ago. Said that no, you can't draw congressional districts on the basis of race. The Constitution is colorblind. This decision caused all sorts of weeping and gnashing of teeth on the left, and now there's a procedural element to it as well, because the winning side in that case went to the court and said, we know that usually you wait 32 days to make an opinion, a decision official. I didn't realize this. You probably don't realize this unless you're a lawyer or followed very closely. But even after the court has released its opinion, it's not final for 32 days. But the winning side says, look, we got all sorts of districts that have been drawn around the country on an unconstitutional race-based basis. So we need to redraw them, including obviously in Louisiana, which was the locus of this case. So the court says, yeah, that makes sense. We'll make it official prior to that usual 32-day interregnum. And Justice Jackson reacted with outrage, basically saying, how can you do this, you monsters? In her dissent, Jackson elucidates what she says should be principles in how the court handles a request to ditch this usual 32-day rule. We'll come back to those supposed principles, but she concludes the court unshackles itself from both constraints, these so-called principles, today, and dives into the fray. She means the partisan fray. And just like that, those principles give way to power, because this abandon is unwarranted and unwise. Respectfully, I dissent. Now, these are the two principles she says should be at play. She cites a prior decision saying that courts should not, quote, risk assuming political responsibility for a partisan map drawing process that often produces ill will and distrust. She also cites the so-called Purcell principle, which we invoked only 5 months ago to chide a federal district court for, quote, improperly inserting itself into an active primary campaign. All right, so let's take on those points in turn. The first, this line about how courts shouldn't insert themselves into drawing district lines because it'll create ill will and the like. This has to do with partisan gerrymandering, which is a firm conviction of the Supreme Court that partisan gerrymandering is not forbidden by the Constitution. It's been part of the process since the founding of the Republic. You might think it's a bad idea. You might think it's grubby and small-minded. Fine, but it's not forbidden by the Constitution, and it's inherently a political process. So that line has to do with the court saying, don't get involved in micromanaging the lines. This partisan gerrymander is okay. This isn't, because then you as a court are inherently part of the political process, and that's a place you don't want to be. Now, in this racial gerrymandering case, what the Supreme Court is effectively saying is we're coming up with one big rule that's mandated by the Constitution, which is that you can't draw the lines by race. You can't do them by race, okay? Otherwise you can draw them however you like. Have at it. It's a political process. It's up to you, not up to us, the court. So this first point from Jackson really has no merit. And then there's this Purcell principle, so-called, which I think is a pretty good idea. The court has basically said, don't change the rules about how you vote, how you hold an election right before the election. Right? It's going to create confusion and all sorts of other problems. My understanding, this really has to do with nitty-gritty questions of how you vote. Do you have to show an ID at the polls? How do you request an absentee ballot? If you have those changed right before a general election, it's a bad idea. I think the court's right about that. Now, there's no doubt that we have this Calais decision, the racial gerrymandering decision, coming hard up against the primary day in Louisiana. And Louisiana is actually delaying its primaries because it wants to redraw the maps. So ideally that wouldn't happen. But look, it's 6 months until the general election. People are still going to vote the same way they always have in Louisiana. It's just that lines are going to be redrawn to fix, and this is a pretty big deal, right? To fix lines that were unconstitutional because they were race-based. So wouldn't everyone want that to be fixed as soon as possible? Well, maybe you wouldn't, and you want to delay it because you just want this Democratic district, so-called majority-minority district, to stay there in Louisiana for partisan purposes. And this is a point that Alito and his colleagues in a concurring opinion firing back at Jackson make. Okay, so to really get in the weeds just for a second, the court has something called Rule 45.3, and that's what sets out what is this usual 32-day waiting period before a decision is made official. But here is Alito responding, and Alito and company, I should say, responding to Jackson. The second reason offered by the dissent, that's Jackson's dissent, is that we should allow the 32-day period to run out in order to avoid the appearance of partiality. But the dissent does not explain why its insistence on unthinking compliance with Rule 45.3's default rule does not create the appearance of partiality by running out the clock on behalf of those who may find it politically advantageous to have the election occur under the unconstitutional current map in Louisiana. By the way, the history of this Louisiana map is quite relevant here. It's not as though Louisiana went into a lab and drew up its congressional districts and was left undisturbed until all of a sudden the Supreme Court came down and said, no, you can't do them that way. It was the opposite. After the 2020 census, Louisiana drew its maps and they had one majority-minority district. That was the subject of legal action. A judge said to Louisiana, you can't do it that way. You're not taking enough account of race. You got to draw a second majority-minority district. That was totally absurd. I mean, it stretched over 250 miles, just randomly connecting all these Black communities. That was challenged in court in turn, and that case made it up to the Supreme Court, and that's why we're talking about it today. But given that history, why wouldn't Louisiana now just get it right? It's already had to change it multiple times. Do it again and make the maps constitutional. The only reason for opposing that, as we we're just discussing, is because you want to delay for partisan reasons. And there may be two elements of that. One is the NAACP, when it responded to this decision, at first said, we're not filing a motion to reconsider to the Supreme Court. We just need time to think about it. All right? So they clearly want to stretch it out for as many weeks as they could, just as a delaying tactic. That didn't work. And then there's this interesting footnote in the Alito opinion. All right, so Alito writes here, the dissent, this is again Jackson's dissent, would require that the 2026 congressional elections in Louisiana be held under a map that has been held to be unconstitutional, asterisk. And here's our footnote. That constitutional question was argued in conference nearly 7 months ago. Now, we can't know what Alito is exactly saying in that footnote, but clearly it is in there for a reason, suggests that this case was basically decided last October and then somehow was slow-walked by the dissenters. Another way for Alito to point out Jackson's hypocrisy. And by the way, very interesting, none of the other progressive justices, not even Sotomayor, joined Jackson in her dissent here, and her intemperance and sloppy jurisprudence are alienating everyone else on the court. Game, set, match, Justice Alito. Now, what about the larger case against the Supreme Court's racial gerrymandering decision? We have the left saying this thing is a hammer blow, just cutting off African-American voters at the knees in terms of their voting rights. Here was a columnist, Jamel Bowie, making that point, that case in the New York Times. The Republican-appointed supermajority on the Supreme Court has delivered the latest in a string of decisions that have weakened the Voting Rights Act's ability to stop racial discrimination in voting and to secure fair representation in both Congress and state legislatures. Now, this is preposterous. The decision in no way affects or undermines anyone's right to vote, and that's what the Voting Rights Act is supposed to be about, the right to vote. The crux of Bowie's point there has to do with what he calls, quote, fair representation. Another lefty outlet called Public Notice made a similar point. The immediate effect of Calais was to invalidate Louisiana's congressional map and eliminate at least one of its two majority Black districts. Black residents make up a third of Louisiana's population. Under the new regime, they'll have a meaningful chance to elect the candidate of their choice in at most one of 6 congressional seats. So what they really want is, if the population of a state is 20% African American, they want 20% of the representatives to be African American, and they're suggesting anything otherwise is a violation of people's rights, and that's absurd. Consider Georgia a couple years ago. There was a Senate race in Georgia. Now, Senate races are different than House races, right? You're not drawing lines on a map for Senate districts. There are no Senate districts. They're just inherently statewide. But it was a race of Herschel Walker versus Raphael Warnock. One former football player, the other a pastor. One a Republican, the other a Democrat, but both African American. If I had lived in Georgia at the time, would I have been disenfranchised as a white person because there was no white candidate on the ballot? That is absolutely preposterous. It's ridiculous. I'm a Christian. I lived in New York City for a very long time. There is now a Muslim American who's mayor of New York City. Would I be disenfranchised if I were living in New York City? No, the way democracy works is you get to have your voice heard, you get to make your vote, and sometimes you win and sometimes you lose. There's no guarantee that someone who looks and have the same ethnic characteristics as you do is necessarily going to win. If you're disenfranchised just because you vote and your candidate doesn't win, I was disenfranchised for decades in New York City because no one I voted for ever won. But that's how democracy works in America, or supposed to work. It does not work on the basis of putting a racial thumb on the scale to get a racialized outcome. We had that for a very long time in this country. It was wrong. It was against American principles, and it's against the American Constitution. But the left is so out of its mind about this racial gerrymandering decision, is so with Justice Jackson, that it's illegitimate, that they are talking seriously about destroying the Supreme Court over it. Here's more from Jamel Bowie. Beyond court reform, that usually means court packing, Americans have to reacquaint themselves with constitutional thinking, with the idea that we, the people, make constitutional meaning. To the extent that the Supreme Court claims broad authority to say what our Constitution means, it is in large part because we have given this authority to the justices through our indifference. It may be the first step in truly reigning in the court is to remember that the Republic and the Constitution that brought it to life is meant for us. It's ours to interpret and ours to transform. Okay, I agree with that. A certain level of abstraction. I think Americans should be more mindful of the Constitution, but court packing would destroy the legitimacy of the court. It would end our constitutional order as we've known it for a very long time. Now, of course, it's true the Constitution ultimately belongs to us, and we can transform it through constitutional amendments. So if Bowie and others want to make it clear that the Constitution is not colorblind, they should write a racialist amendment for the U.S. Constitution to say that all sorts of race-based decisions are fine, including drawing congressional districts by race. Now, that would be totally perverse, and they'd have limited or zero chance of success, but have at it. Now, since that's not going to happen, what he's ultimately talking about is just having progressive justices, once again, ignoring the text of the Constitution and reinterpreting it in real time to make it a leftist ideological tool. That's what Justice Jackson ultimately wants. That's what she's not getting. And that is why, at the end of the day, she is very, very upset. I'm Rich Lowry, over and